Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2023. This is a summer-long BookTube event created by Vin at Revenant Reads. We're actually in our third year of celebrating Star Trek fiction in all of its forms and shapes and sizes, any kind of franchise, any kind of time period, whatever suits your fancy. If you read Star Trek during the summer of 2023, you have participated in Book Trek. It's far looser in its organization than earlier years. I've been having a blast. Of course, I love reading Star Trek stuff, even when it's bad. There's still a guilty pleasure involved there. So I've been adding lots of Star Trek to my reading. It's not always possible. Sometimes the reading crowds things out, and I admit Star Trek is one of the first things to go when it does. There'll always be Star Trek, and Book Trek still has a long time, a whole month to go. So there's still plenty of time. But I did read something last night, and I couldn't quite decide what I wanted to do, what I was in the mood for. So I thought, it might be time to go back to an anthology, something that has everything. So I did this. I did Dean Wesley Smith's Star Trek Strange New Worlds Volume 3. This was an anthology that went on for well over a decade, where fans and non-professionals could submit short stories about all the then-existing franchises of Star Trek. And the book is organized along franchise lines. So it starts with the original series, and then The Next Generation, and then Deep Space Nine, then Voyager. I think some of the later ones have Enterprise stories in them. I'm pretty sure they do. I think I've read that. I welcome this. I want to stress this is not Strange New Worlds, the new Trek show that is currently airing on cable. This is just a callback to one of the great phrases in the original prologue of the original show, the spoken prologue of the original show. And it is an instantiation of a tradition that was started decades and decades earlier. Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth, two original Star Trek fans, started a fan short story anthology series, The New Voyages and The New Voyages 2. They didn't get any further than 2, although they got bombarded with enough information to get them to 100. And then decades and decades passed, and then Dean Wesley Smith and a couple of other people came up with the idea to do this again, to do this series again. And it went for a long time and then stopped. I don't know why it stopped. I would love it if it were still going on. Probably I would hate the stories, but I like the blurring of the line between pro and amateur that Star Trek has always done. But I went through this anthology. I think it brought back memories. I think this was the last of these anthologies that I actually read as they were coming out. And you're in any anthology like this, it's going to be uneven. It's going to be an uneven reading experience. That was true with Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth in New Voyages and the New Voyages 2, even though they were exercising far heavier editorial hands to smooth out and level the quality field of those stories they got than any of these editors do. It's still going to be uneven. You're still not going to know what you're getting. And on top of that, the rules for Strange New Worlds for your story limit what you can do. This is not just pastiche fiction. This is limited pastiche fiction. So there's only so much you can do, which means that in very narrow parameters like that, you've got to be really good to make your story work. And not all writers are very good. Most writers are very bad. So nothing will show it more pitilessly than the rules for an anthology like this. For instance, you can't change the canon. In even a minor way, you can't change the canon. You can't say that a minor character who we see die actually didn't die. You can't do that. Unless you get permission from Paramount, you can't do that in fiction. An example was made for Star Trek Enterprise at one point in the books. Maybe we'll get to that in Book Trek. But usually not. An ordinary writer, no. You can't do that. And also, you can't add to the lore. You can't say, well, you can't kill a character, even a minor character, and you also can't change them. You can't do what so many early Star Trek novels did and just default to making either T'Pring or Dr. M'Benga the villain of the novel. You can't do that either. So you're really, really limited, which means that in these short stories, a lot of them will come across more as fictional meditations on a moment than anything else, which is deadly. That is deadly. You have to be a really good writer to make that interesting. And most writers, as mentioned, are not really good. And that happens a lot here. A perfect example of what I'm talking about is Lieutenant Hawk from Star Trek First Contact, from a Star Trek The Next Generation movie, played by a young and startlingly gorgeous Neil McDonough, he's an interesting character in that movie, and he is meant to show us in that movie the human face of assimilation by the Borg. We know him. We get to know him a little as a bridge officer, and then he is assimilated. And you're supposed to feel that more than just anonymous crew people being assimilated, and you do. It works. It absolutely works. But the minute fans got wind of the fact that in canon, had Lieutenant Hawk had a little more screen time, it was going to be revealed that he was the very first in-canon gay Star Trek character. The minute fans learned that, they took him up with a cause. They took him up with a vengeance. Well, other people can get assimilated, but not our guy. Not if he's this pretty. And there's a story in here about Lieutenant Hawk. It's not about his past. It's about the minutes that we see him in that movie. It's about him being assimilated. And, okay, well, the story doesn't last for long, and it is interesting in the way the writer tries to dramatize what it would feel like to be assimilated. For instance, Lieutenant Hawk is surprised that there's no pain. But I guess if we were being poncy, it would throw us back on big capital letter questions like, what is a short story, or what is drama? If you already know everything that's going to happen to the main character, then what are you reading? What are you reading? The writer of that short story does not have the ability to save Lieutenant Hawk from assimilation. Doesn't have permission to do that. And besides, we already know what happens to Lieutenant Hawk. We know what happens to him once he's assimilated. So you would have to change canon. And if you're not allowed to change minor canon in a TV show, you are absolutely not allowed to change canon in a multi-million-dollar movie. For good or ill, I would argue mostly for ill, the powers that be at Paramount and Pocket Books and Gene Roddenberry himself all declared that if you see it on the screen, it happened. And if you didn't, it didn't. And that the bigger the screen, the more demonstrative the happening. I don't agree with that. That links dramatic arcs to money. It's never a good idea to do, but nevertheless, that is the way in Star Trek. So in a story like that, it's a perfect example of how you know what's going to happen. You know what can and cannot happen. That happens all throughout here. We get, for instance, Ezri Dax. Those of you who are fans of Deep Space Nine will know that forever and ever on Deep Space Nine, we get to know Jadzia Dax, who is the latest. Jadzia is the latest Trill host for a Trill symbiont that lives in her body, a big slug-like thing that lives in her body, but that is centuries old. The Dax symbiont is centuries old. Jadzia is not. Jadzia is a young woman. A little bit of tricky to get used to, but you do get used to it, largely thanks to the fantastic performance in Deep Space Nine. And at the climax of Deep Space Nine, Jadzia Dax is killed by Gul Dukat, by one of the nuanced villains of Deep Space Nine. Jadzia is killed, but the symbiont survives. And the symbiont there's an emergency extraction made, and it is inserted into a different Trill named Ezri. Fans were not overly in love with that. They didn't think that Ezri Dax that we should ever meet her. They didn't think that she should be back on the same station where her predecessor had died about 15 minutes before. They thought, okay, we understand the Trill concept, and we loved Jadzia Dax. We are glad that the Trill symbiont, Dax, survives, but we don't want to meet the next host. And much less, Jadzia Dax was in love with Lieutenant Worf. Now, all of a sudden, there's a person on board the Enterprise who remembers all of that, lived through those memories, but is not herself in love with Lieutenant Worf, and he's not in love with her. It's a Star Trek direction, a Deep Space Nine direction that I didn't agree with, but we get a story here of what the first week of having the Dax symbiont is like for Ezri Dax. That will not violate canon. We did not see that. We know that it happened, and we know that it comes out all right. So you know that the Ezri Dax's body doesn't reject the symbiont. You know that neither one of them dies, neither one of them turns bad. You know all of that, which you shouldn't know in an effective short story. But you don't know any of those, what it was like for her to meet all of those previous memories, all those previous hosts. So we get a story like that. It's very Potemkin short stories, very fussing around with little details, which is pretty much what you're stuck with if you're writing under rules like this. I enjoyed some of these stories, but most of them, just had the feeling of, I've watched this episode way too many times, and here's my idea of what happens in between minute 1 and minute 2 of this particular moment. There was one major exception here. The one story is from the original series. The one story that I thought was the best one was one in which Mr. Spock is summoned back to Earth by his mother's sister, by his human aunt, whose daughter has been in an accident and she is in a coma. And her mother is so desperate for some sort of help, someone to reach her daughter and bring her back to consciousness, that she's willing to ask, with Amanda Grayson, Spock's mother's help, she's willing to take Mr. Spock's help in this regard for Vulcan healing rituals, even a Vulcan mind meld. Even though, as is revealed in the course of the story, Amanda Grayson's sister is a bigot. She's bigoted against Vulcans, and also personally aggrieved, because her sister married an alien, Ambassador Sarek, and left the planet. Went to live and make her home on an alien world. Her sister has been fed a lot of propaganda about how deceitful Vulcans are, about how untrustworthy they are, about how suborning they are, how evil they are, and she's largely swallowed all of it. So even though her own nephew is a Vulcan, she doesn't like them. But she swallows a lot of that. She endures a lot of that bigotry in order to have Spock go to the hospital and meet with her daughter and try to help her. And Spock is moved by compassion. He wants to help this, what would she be to him? Cousin, anyway, that he's never really met, that he doesn't really know. Keep in mind, Amanda Grayson's sister has never been to Vulcan. This daughter has never met her aunt. And Spock goes, the story takes place in Boston in wintertime. Spock is not acclimated to the cold. He doesn't like the cold anyway, and that comes up a couple of times, that Boston in winter is not very hospitable. This story was written 10 years ago. I don't believe that Boston in the 10 years since this story came out, Boston has had 10 winters, but only 2 killing frosts, and it's only snowed a handful of times. So I don't think it's going to snow again in Boston. I don't think there's any chance that there will be a killing frost in Boston ever again. So in other words, the story is already dated. I think in 10 years, if someone were to read this story, it would probably be me. It'd be even more inconceivable that Boston in winter would be anything but balmy. But Mr. Spock goes to the hospital, and he realizes that the young woman is so far gone that he does actually need to mind meld with her. A Vulcan healer won't mind meld with someone, a stranger. Spock can't. She's a family member. So he does, and it's well done. It's well written. He eventually finds her lost inside her own mentality, and offers to bring her back out into the world. And that is the dramatic part of the story, but the heart of it really is the stuff that comes around there. The idea of Mr. Spock in an overcoat. The idea of Mr. Spock in the old Grayson family home. There's a wonderful scene where his aunt is slowly warming to him, as you would expect in a Star Trek story. She's slowly warming to him. And there's a wonderful scene when they get back from the hospital one night where she admits to him that she never uses the kitchen. She doesn't have any automated 21st century technology. It's still an old kitchen. It's a museum piece. And she admits to him that she's been so preoccupied with her daughter and spending so much time at the hospital that she mostly just orders out. Hasn't made any food in a while in the kitchen. And Spock offers to make supper for them. And does. And he considers it fascinating, to use a phrase, to use a term. He's enticed at the idea of being able to make a palatable meal in such a strange and wonderful antique kitchen. At that moment, the picture in your mind of Spock making dinner for 2 is really good. It's really well done. And, of course, the story ends with Amanda Grayson's sister vowing that the operation is a success, of course. The young woman is brought back to consciousness. And it changes everything. It changes the way Amanda's sister looks at Vulcans, or at least this one Vulcan. And she also agrees that it's high time she visited Vulcan and met her sister again. It's just a tiny little thing, and you can see why it was allowed under the rules of the story. We know nothing about Amanda Grayson's siblings. we know nothing about that at all. It's open territory. As long as you don't kill any of them or have any of them president of Earth or a secret Romulan or whatever, you're free to write a story like that, and it's gracefully done. There are a couple of moments like that here. Nothing really to talk about in Voyager. A little bit in Deep Space Nine. There are moments in that Ezri Dax story that are pretty good, but it's an uneven story anthology. It's leading me to think that maybe I need to just stick with novels. Definitely stick with novels so that they aren't uneven. Most novels, if the author is C-grade lout, there'll be a C-grade lout throughout. Maybe my next couple of Book Trek picks should be Star Trek novels that I know well. Maybe to get my mojo back, I should reread a couple of Star Trek favorites. Maybe I'll do that. We'll see. I have a lot of reading planned for tonight. A major biography, and then to follow up that biography, a huge amount. I've got to do a huge amount of secondary reading, and not in English. So that may push a lot of other stuff to the side. And like I said, Star Trek novels, they're the quintessential light summer fare, so they don't get priority. I may not have a Book Trek report for you tomorrow, but we shall see. I will wrap this up for now, and we'll find out together. I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.